What do we do in the post-Wuhan virus world? The greatest challenge after the current pandemic is not going to be what actions we took in an obviously out of balance society and its institutions, but how we respond in the aftermath to rebalance the system without making things worse. The COVID-19 pandemic has inflicted serious destruction, both in loss of life and economically here in the United States. But as with all crises, it is exposing systemic weaknesses both in society and our institutions. There can be little doubt that every American is now very aware of how fragile the system within he or she lives truly is. That system is out of balance, and it will emerge from the crisis with substantial changes. The nature of those changes will be a mix of reactive and proactive modifications. Some proactive changes will be intended to reduce the exposure to disease in the future. Others are going to be driven by an extreme motivation to, quote, never let it happen again, unquote. The irony is the latter approach is ultimately guaranteed to imbalance the system further rather than balance it as the post-9/11 system did. As crises go, the COVID-19 pandemic will likely not be the largest or longest lasting crisis in recent memory. Both the Great Depression and World War II will dwarf it by comparison. It's already eclipsed 9/11 in loss of life, but the duration and economic impact of its cure remains to be seen. It may or may not behave similarly to the 1918 pandemic. The most important action now is to take advantage of our heightened focus to assess the overall health of the nation itself and how to assess how well we reacted to the crisis. All the talk about supply chains highlights an unhealthy systemic imbalance. There are at least three questions that need to be asked. What should be done about our supply chains? How valuable have the models we've been using to make decisions been? How effective were the non-pharmaceutical interventions? And the list could go on. Well, my guest today wrote these words. Air Force veteran, author, and modeling expert Dennis Howell joins me to discuss these extremely important questions and more as we move into the post-pandemic world. Dennis Howell, author of Political Vertigo and The Road to Americanism, and modeling expert, Air Force veteran, and my friend. Thank you for coming on the Rob Maness Show, sir.
Rob, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and it's great to see all that wonderful background there with the Air Force insignia and everything. Very cool. Good to see you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I hope things are going well out in your part of America, out in Colorado. From the pandemic perspective, our family is all doing well, and we're just continuing to do what we've been doing since mid-March or so.
Yeah, we could have a lot of discussion about what's going on right now, but
yes, we could. But let's talk about your impending publication and how it relates to things like Americanism, politics, and not just that, but our society in general and our institutions and how out of balance they appear to be. In your upcoming publication, you discuss that and are going to address what we need to do so that we rebalance our systems, our society and institutional systems, and try not to get them out of balance, similar to what happened in the post-9/11 world, especially in national security and homeland security.
Well, right, Rob. And actually, excuse me, the first two books I wrote were really on the Constitution itself, the written Constitution, the theory behind it, and its history. But what I've actually started doing, and it's kind of weird that I happen to be a mathematician, a computer scientist, and like you say, a modeler. I professionally did modeling for Digital Equipment Corporation in the 80s. At the time, it was the second largest computer company in the world. And I was actually kind of the queuing theory expert, which all these statistical models that you're actually hearing about right now, it's related to simulations and emulations and a whole host of things, but it's basically mathematics. And like you mentioned, getting out of balance. And if you look at like a guitar string, you have harmonics. And like you mentioned, 9/11. Well, actually, 9/11 was kind of a little harmonic in terms of us getting out of balance. If you go back further, we actually got perhaps the most out of balance after the Depression. And it started with Social Security. And of course, you get these economic highs and lows. And so we will always have balancing issues. But I think that what really dictates how in balance we are is when we try to rebalance, that we actually make matters worse. And the reason we do that is that we're micro-focused on just the last thing that happened instead of taking a look at the overall system and say, now, wait a minute. We're so out of balance here, here, and here. Let's not be the Dutch boy. Let's go and really kind of shore this up. It'll never be perfect. We'll never be invincible, but let's try to do a better job.
Yeah, you're like me and a lot of other military professionals. We use a systematic approach to problem solving.
That's right.
It's drilled into us for decades, but it's also effective. And I was very interested in reading your draft paper about that you did lay out that society and our institutions are out of balance. You addressed 3 or 4 questions that we need to take a look at. I mean, the one that really stands out to me that I started writing on very early in this pandemic issue is the supply chain. The supply chain, what I wrote about was very specific about the pharmaceutical supply chain and how China generates 90% of antibiotic and some other pharmaceutical materials that are used to make key things like antibiotics and penicillin and those kind of things. But I think it's, as we've watched it develop over these last 2 months, though, and folks have really started pulling the layers back, it's a much bigger issue than just pharmaceuticals, isn't it? And how do we address that so we can rebalance that part of the system?
It's absolutely way bigger. For example, in my own personal experience as a computer nerd for like 45 years, in the early 80s, I worked for Intel. And just lucky placement, when you power up a PC, since PCs have existed, I actually worked in the business before that. And I'm actually the guy that developed what was called the legacy BIOS. And what happened there is I didn't create everything from scratch. I was actually the project lead of what was called the NDS2 project. And I could get on to gobbledygook here, but the bottom line is I took software that we had on the shelf and I took the specs that IBM sent us, and I had people that were too busy doing this in ours, and we were working 100-hour work weeks. So I basically just took the spec and took what we had, and I modified what we had to make it work with that and sent it to Florida to the IBM guys. So anyway, in 2012, I was working for Jabil, which is the second largest, what they call contract manufacturer. The largest one is Foxconn, which people probably heard of. They make all the Apple stuffs like the iPhones. Celestica is number 2, but Jabil's number 3. A very big company. They're larger than Lockheed Martin. And anyway, I got off onto a BIOS project as a system architect because EMC had gotten themselves in a corner because what Intel had done is they had obsoleted the legacy BIOS and replaced it with a whole big framework. Anyway, and to make a long story short and all that, what I found out is there are only 3 BIOS companies in the world. There's AMI, which is based in Georgia. There's Phoenix, which I don't know if they're still around because they were in receivership. And then there's Insight, which Insight's in Taiwan. And AMI is, their engineers are not in Georgia. And it turns out that all the BIOS stuff is being done offshore, mainly in China and Taiwan. Now, there are other bootstrap softwares but that's the dominant one. So anything running Windows, that's what you're going to have. So everything, you take your car, you take your TV, right? They've all got a computer embedded in them, and they have this BIOS embedded in them, and it's burned into a chip, and that is not done in the United States. So we were at extreme risk in the supply chain, just right there, if no place else.
Yeah, is there are there tools and techniques that can be used to prevent things like malware or malcode?
Not against that. I mean, whoever makes that rules the roost. You can do anything when you're the first code that runs.
Yeah, exactly. That's very unfortunate. That's a key piece to the supply chain in the digital world, in everything.
Yeah.
Every single thing. Every combat platform we have is highly digitized today, even the ones that were built in the 1950s and 60s, like the B-52. So that's a major national security concern. And of course, on the health side in the pharmaceutical industry, that's a major, I think most people understand now what we in the military and health communities have known for a long time is that, health security is national security. And we need to make sure that we have the appropriate manufacturing capability that we can control in a crisis. And it's obvious right now with the China situation that we really put ourselves in danger with the global economy approach, haven't we?
Exactly. And, when we were growing up, you had Made in the USA was stamped on things, and we were proud of that. And we expected to pay a little more. And the reality is we lost sight of that and the importance of it. And today, I think we may have a renewed appreciation for that. At least I hope we do.
So the computer industry, the pharmaceutical industry, both of those areas, we need to take a really hard look at post-pandemic and rebalance those so that we have the right capabilities under our control. Which makes perfect sense, and why I like the term America First for policies like the current president uses. The guy's not perfect, but that's one that I think we got too far away from, and this crisis is revealing that to every single American, as you said. But what about the models themselves, Dennis? These models that have been being used. I wrote about the imperial model and how apparently it was used to convince major decision makers, including the president, that we could lose 2.2 million people and even 1 million or so with mitigation, and that has led to some of the measures that have been taken. Not saying that we shouldn't have made decisions using these types of things, knowing that that informationally they were weak, and from a data structure about this particular virus, they were weak, because you kind of have to go to war with the army you have at the time the war starts, when it's the enemy like this virus that launches the first attack. But the modeling has gone on, and now we have the IHME model out of the Gates Foundation, the University of Washington out of Washington State, or the Murray model, I think is what it's also called. And I've seen changes in that model just in the last 8 days that have taken my home state from Louisiana to looking like it was going to exceed capacity in 72 hours a little over a week ago, to now that modeling is not even close to exceeding our medical capacity. And we spent a lot of resources and efforts building extra capacity that only the mitigation efforts that we're undertaking couldn't possibly have had enough of an impact to reduce these numbers this way. And you're talking about orders of magnitude. So how do we address that in the post-Wuhanvirus world, so that we have better capabilities to do that? Because it's big data, it's complex information, and you and I know, because we're military guys, that we can make decisions based on thin intelligence, but the better the information you have at the time you make the decision, the better decision you can make, and the less you have to change vector on or change direction on as you go down the path.
That's right. Well, there's a whole lot I could say in that. I mean, from a mathematical sense, the phenomenon that you're seeing to a degree is kind of what, the common jargon is the knee of the curve. But the reality is that we shouldn't trust modeling to the extent that we do. And it's my contention that that is a holdover from the original progressive movement, which had an innate belief that we could control nature, which is seriously flawed. We can't. And as far as the models themselves, let me be specific on this, because I actually downloaded the source code. I've looked at the source code for the Imperial College model, and it's not models plural. What's plural is the data set that's being fed into the models.
Yeah. Okay.
And what is being fed into the models is not any absolute data. It's an abstraction of the effects of the virus. You don't have any of the personality of the virus directly put into a statistical model. A statistical model by nature is just taking the effect and trying to quantify it. And it's a wag. It's never exact. And what happens with the nature of these models as you go forward in time, it's like differential equations. As time progresses, they become more accurate. So at the time that you need them the most, right at the beginning, they're the least accurate. So, I mean, the good news in all this is at the time when you don't need them as much, they're more accurate. So if there's any silver lining in that, as far as this pandemic goes, we should be able to have a pretty good projection on when it's safe to come out of our houses, if you will. But I got to caveat that, okay? And here's the caveat. Everybody's showing you the classic bell curve. And that's not the way complex systems act. They behave according to what's called the power law. And now the bad news on that is a power law essentially looks kind of like a bell curve, only the tail off to the right doesn't cross the x-axis or the y-axis. It just keeps going. And the bad news on that is that's why you can get a second wave.
Absolutely.
So,
well, how do we address that? Because here in the United States, freedom is the core principle the whole thing is built on, in the Constitution. And we've seen these models used to reinforce some measures that are just absolutely tyrannical,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have public health measures that keeps people safe if we have to go there. For example, the max number of people at a gathering. But what I am saying is that sane implementation of these measures, which are really not legal orders, from a legal sense, judges will tell you that these orders are not really enforceable under law by and large in a lot of cases, but they're really requests, and they're requests for us to do the things that need to be done to keep people safe, as long as we need to do it until we figure this whole problem out. I think the reason why the first stay-at-home order was issued was, well, we've got to keep our medical capability from being exceeded. That made sense. That made perfect sense to people, regardless of what the models said at the time. And it was just going to be a couple of weeks. Well, now that order has shifted, the reasoning for it has now shifted, and the politicians are saying, well, we've got to beat the virus. Well, you and I both know that's not what happens. If you can't contain it, and we went out of containment in February down here in Louisiana, any effort to contain this thing broke out around the country in the New Orleans Mardi Gras, which has people from all over the world there.
Oh, yeah.
And so containment was finished. We didn't contain people coming from Europe. We did stop travel from China, but that wasn't going to contain this thing. So now we're in mitigation. And mitigation is this things like stay-at-home orders. Okay, we understand that. Well, we have flattened that part of the curve out. And we've learned a lot about the virus in the meantime, but we still don't have enough testing. We don't have antibody testing readily available at the individual level, like for you and me. I can't go to Walgreens or CVS
Right.
pharmacy and ask to get a test. I can't even call my doctor really and ask to get a test unless I'm symptomatic for this disease. But the big deal is that we've really strung ourselves out on restricting freedoms that really aren't necessary.
Oh, I totally agree. I actually, I had to laugh. I actually liked what our governor out here in Colorado, Jared Polis, said before he actually instituted the confinements that we're under here, in which he said, I can't give you orders what to do, but the Grim Reaper can. And this gets down to if it's voluntary. And, one of the hallmarks of a republic is the people do what's good for them, not what they want to do. And so like where that relates, I mean, everybody's seen the beach, the spring breakers out on the beach.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot that could be said about that. I mean, were they irresponsible? Sure. But did they know any better? Well, did anybody tell them? Did anybody explain to them just how dire it was? I don't think they did. And I think a lot of it is we just didn't really understand how deadly this virus was. And like we compared it to the Spanish flu, totally different characterization. With the Spanish flu, they didn't have any vaccine or anything to fight it, just like we don't now.
Yeah.
But the nature of it, the way that it killed mainly people 18 to 40, that's totally different characteristic than like what's happening with this, which we hear it's the elderly like us, but what's coming out now, it looks like it's more underlying conditions. Yeah. And one of my friends up in Minnesota actually had it, and he had asthma. And it was interesting because just a day or two before he contracted it, he told his boss he figured if he got it, he was a goner. Well, he licked it. And well, what happened is his doctor, first of all, he goes, should I go to the hospital? His doctor said, absolutely not. That is the wrong place for you to go. There's all sorts of disease there. So he made him stay at home. He didn't get the I keep forgetting how to pronounce it anyway. He didn't get the right. No. Yeah. Anyway, he just, right. He had an antibiotic and just gutted it out. Mm-hmm. But so it even seems like it's more related to, it sounds like that diabetes is probably the biggest exposure, but you never know because it killed that sailor on the aircraft carrier.
Yeah, so, Roosevelt. Already passed from that. Yeah, you never know. It's my wife is a cancer survivor, and
she's exposed.
I'm on medication for high blood pressure plus an asthmatic. So we just decided we're gonna, we'll stay to ourselves and do our thing, and nobody stops us from leaving our house though. We're not seeing things in Louisiana quite like what you're seeing around some of the other parts of the country, like in Michigan, where the governor has said you can't even go to your second home if you have a cabin up in the hills. And you can't walk across the street to your family member's house and those kinds of things. It's just ridiculous. And it gets back to my question about the modeling. The modeling is a direct source of some of these really, really strong man actions.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you saw that video that Cliff from Yale put out, right, with the doctor out of, I think it was North Dakota, who's also a state senator. had the graphic, and it was pointing how, you know, we need to keep the peak of the curve below the capacity, but you get politicians involved and they want to stomp it all the way to zero, which is impossible.
Yeah, we're in mitigation. We're not in containment.
Yeah.
You cannot do that. It's not possible to get that job done anymore. The best thing is the next steps, and I've been calling for it since March 26 in my writing and opinions, and that is that we focus on the areas that are the hot zones the most, as far as the you know, any necessary draconian measures, and we get plans out to get people back to work, and give people, you know, common sense, voluntary guidance based on what we know of the virus. We isolate those folks that need to be isolated, the high risk, the folks that are most at high risk, do voluntary isolation and testing. I've said from day one, you're not going to figure this thing out now that you can't contain it without having mass testing. And we still have not achieved mass testing. I understand the president talks about millions of tests given and all that. That's right. That's accurate. And that's good. But we've got to take it a step further, don't you think? So that real data that's much more robust can be fed into the modeling to show what this virus is actually capable of.
Well, and just the nature of this virus is tough, right? I mean, if it takes, 5 days to 14 days to incubate, you're asymptomatic. That's a tough disease to crack because you don't even know if you need a test. And in the meanwhile, you know, time is moving forward, which means the time where you want the modeling is already skewed out of your control. So I think this is the big thing about this virus, is that we don't have any innate ability to actually tell I'm possibly infectious or recognize somebody that I need to stay away from. So I don't think there's anything humanly possible that can be done about that. However, I think as soon as you could, more than trusting the modeling, which I think you have to put a certain amount of faith in, because I looked the other day and we were like at 1/5 of the peak capacity. It was what we peaked at. And it's like, well, ideally you would like that to be somewhere between half and 90%, really, if you wanted to look to optimality. Not saying optimality is good, because that would be relying on the modeling too much. So to a degree, tamping it down that far is relying less on the modeling. But what I think that we haven't really done is a good job of really figuring out what are the characteristics of this virus. So like the thing that I heard, I don't know if I trust it, that we're talking about staying 6 feet away, and then the China study said, well, actually, if you're expelling from the front, it could be up to 13 feet. They say 4 meters. Or if it's behind you, you could be shedding up to 8 feet.
Yeah.
It's like, well, now at that point, how much good is the social distancing really doing? I mean, is that really that viable? I don't know. You know, I mean, certainly it's better not to be close to people that are infectious, but as to how beneficial that is, I really don't know how to gauge that.
That, and, you know, I'm convinced that my wife's probably been a carrier of this thing. She worked over in the New Orleans area, at a retail store in a mall up until third week of March, and they finally closed it down, laid everybody off. And she's healthy and everything. We're here 4 weeks later almost, and but in all likelihood, she had it, was carrying it, which means that I've got it, my son's got it, and we'd like to be able to go get tested and see if we have the antibodies,
Right.
Or have been exposed to it. And until we get to that point, it's going to be very difficult to let our high-risk population go without social distancing. And the folks that are at low risk are going to have to be cognizant of that, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. And you actually bring up a good point, because the modeling I didn't see the source code for IHME, but they referred to this SIR model, which is essentially what's behind all this. And that stands for susceptible, infectious, and recovery. And the tricky part of that is that last one, the R, recovering, and the susceptible. There's also another model called SIS, where there's no recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for, they use that for the common cold and the flu. And the reason is you don't build up antibodies. So you never build up an immunity. It's hard to say if we actually do build up an immunity with this one. I don't know that we've studied it that closely.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions that we really truly need to answer if we're, depending on how much measures we think we need to take to prevent a second wave, right?
Oh yeah, or a third one, because there were 3 waves for the Spanish flu.
And it was the third one that was really, really deadly, wasn't it?
Well, it was the second one, but that's because they had a bond drive in Philadelphia and they had 200,000 people packed into like 14 blocks. Ginny's maternal grandparents actually both died because of that, because she was from there.
Oh, wow. God bless.
Yeah.
Let's, I don't think we'll be doing any of those kinds of things for a long, long time. I do think we're at a point now where we know enough we can get this economy back open. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. You know, this is one of those things where you're guaranteed to be wrong whichever way you go. So, you know, sometimes you got to go with your gut. But on that, I just don't see how there's any choice but to open up the economy. And maybe the right thing to do is look at how effective our mitigation strategies really have been. And, you know, I mean, is herd immunity real? If it is, then I would suggest that we've done the wrong thing all along. If it isn't real, then I don't know. That's why I don't get paid the bucks that the president does.
Yeah, those questions the answers are out there. You know, we've got a totally different situation in California than we have in New York City.
Yeah.
The potential for a herd immunity theory to have taken hold in California, because, you know, we think that some folks think that the virus got there a lot earlier than anybody knows, and it started that way. And there's some good writing going on about that now. Hopefully we can get some full-fledged peer-reviewed studies done on that soon. And then our therapeutics, and that was your third question that I wanted to talk about today, is, you know, how do we assess the effectiveness of the therapeutics, and did they work the way we wanted them to? What can we do to change that if we need to? And how do we balance that system? Because there seems to be, there's a lot of frustration with the therapeutics process, and a lot of frustration on all sides with how we even talk about some of these therapeutics that are happening today.
Well, if you look at them, those what do they call them? Non-pharmaceutical interventions. That if you look at it, they're almost identical to what they tried in 1918. And the whole mask fiasco is very similar too, because in San Francisco, they put their total faith in masks in 1918, but it turned out that those masks were totally ineffective against that virus. Now, we think the N95 masks are effective, and there's still a debate on, well, the cloth ones are no good, but if you use a shop towel inside of it, then that's better. It's not as good. And we also, a friend of mine pointed out, for clean rooms, we actually have masks that are even better than N95s because of the ppm in the clean rooms has to be so minuscule. I don't know how much of those get made, but anyway, this all loops back to in order to address that as an effective solution, you have to have the supply chain that you can do top to bottom ramp up, you know. And one of the problems with our supply chains is the business schools. Number one, they look at the bell curve, and mainly they look at the median. And there's another thing called standard deviation. and tuning your supply chain according to that. Well, that's not optimal in terms of cash flow. And so if you look at what we're going through economically right now, part of it's because we've ratcheted down the optimization criteria that we use for company goodness. I mean, these companies are just fragile because of the way they go.
Is that like streamlining or something like just-in-time logistics, where you have a steady flow of small numbers and you don't keep large numbers of capability on hand, whether it's a widget or whatever?
Right, but it's also a potential solution, right? I mean, if you target your just in time so that you're looking ahead and saying, okay, on that line, I'm producing this, but it's like wartime thinking, which the current administration's done a fabulous job of looking at what we've done in World War II and partnering with the private public sector. Spot on. And where you've got these companies that are retooling to make other things, exactly the right answer. However, the problem's going to be if this thing does go away and doesn't come back. Now we've got all this glut in the market, and also now we've got to retool and all that, and we've done it so hastily, we're going to have a lot of waste in there. And unfortunately, the way we are in this country, we've adopted the notion of, well, Uncle Sugar will pick up the slack, which Uncle Sugar means you and I are going to be paying more taxes and the government's going to grow.
Yeah, and hang on to that stimulus check, because they're going to take it back from you eventually.
I was going to say, are you getting one? I don't think I am.
I don't know if I am or not, quite honestly.
Well, quite honestly, I don't want one. I want us to get away from these brain dead solutions, because they're not solutions at all.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to have that much of an impact. The larger thing that would have an impact is if we get this economy open as much as possible, while focusing on, micro focusing on the high risk populations, and keeping the folks that are low risk separated, and get this thing figured out with testing, and whether we are developing antibodies and immunity to it, and or is it more like the common cold and the flu virus, which we don't, as we develop a vaccine in very rapid fashion. So Dennis, I want to say thank you very much for coming on today. This is a complicated subject. Very few people can speak to it in a credible and intelligent way. And I appreciate you bearing with me with my my layperson questions and those kind of things. But I think our audience will get a lot out of this discussion. How can folks find you and pitch your books real quick?
Well, the easiest way to find me is Jenny pulled off a coup. We scored a domain name called libertyreads.com, spelled just like it sounds, Liberty Reads, one word. And that'll bring you to a landing page that then points to my blog, The Americanist, which I have two co-hosts. You've been on it, Dave Morgan and Ron Scott, my Air Force Academy class president. The three of us do a blog. And then, I'm sorry, not blog, but a podcast. Yeah. And then I have a blog. It is dhod.com is the name of that. But anyway, the two books are Political Vertigo and The Road to Americanism. And The Road to Americanism I just published in December. And they're both out on Amazon. You can find them on the website. Just take a look.
Well, I appreciate it. And I have copies of the books, folks. I'm on my way to finishing reading them. They're very good and very well done. And
thanks, Rob.
Look forward to the next one, which I know you're going to do at some point, especially while we're locked down. Maybe you can whip one out, so to speak.
Well, I'm going to try to get one published by the end of summer that's related to what we've been talking about here.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Dennis Haw, author,
thank you, Rob.
Air Force veteran, my friend from out in Colorado. libertyreads.com, and you can find everything that this man and his team do. And we'll see you next time on the Rob Maness Show.
Thank you, sir.